Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, The Answer.
If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. How serious is the violent crime problem in Blue City, America? How serious is it? It's so serious that Minneapolis is funding its police department. That's how serious it is.
Wow.
I think the defund the police movement has had its moment, and it is since passed, which is good news. But you still have the problems that we've been discussing for years, and most notably just even the last few days, of a mentality that supports defunding and supports decarceration, even to the extent that you can't get the defunding done as substantially as some politicians and seemingly prosecutors would like. For more on the data, we're pleased to be joined by Rafael Mangual, who's City Journal and Manhattan Institute, noted writer, author on all things urban policy related, particularly with respect to crime. Rafael, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me back.
So you wrote this piece in the Journal the other day that we referenced on the show that really puts this puts the data to what people are experiencing and think is happening. And it also gives lie to the efforts by a craven political class, and that would definitely include the D.C. press corps, as they try to, contextualize their way out of the serious violent crime problem we have in urban America.
Yeah, that's right. I think, a lot of, people who have sort of considered themselves and styled themselves as criminal justice reformers over the years, and a lot of their allies are starting to worry. And I think they're getting nervous because polling seems to indicate that the American people are now placing crime among their top concerns. We've got a couple of elections that just happened earlier this year in which crime was a prominent issue. I mean, New York City, for example, voted in Eric Adams as mayor. Eric ran on a sort of anti-crime platform. So I think a lot of the reformers are starting to get nervous, and so there are a couple of ways that they could handle that. They could either walk back some of the radical ideas that they've supported and admit to the American public that they're not going so well, or they can do what they seem to have chosen to do, which is to minimize the problem by essentially gaslighting the public by either telling them that, well, things aren't really as bad as you think, or if you put all crime categories together, crime is still down. And, this is not what Americans need to hear. And so what I wanted to do in the Wall Street Journal piece was just kind of explain, what one particular tactic, which is the comparison of today to the 1990s, why that tactic is essentially meaningless. And, there are basically two realities that ignores. One is that, what a lot of people are doing is they're saying, well, look, if you take the national homicide rate, for example, and you compare it to what it was in the 80s and 90s, our homicide rate is still far lower. We're talking, 40% lower today. And that should be a cause for, a sense of relief. Unfortunately, though, the national homicide rate represents an aggregation of homicides across the entire country measured up against the entire population. And, it's essentially a meaningless number because at the end of the day, none of us live in the aggregate. We all live in particular places at particular times. So, one of the things that I mentioned in the column was, well, what does it matter if, a handful of Chicago suburbs can offset the impact of the South and West Side on the national homicide rate? I mean, that's little consolation to the people who are stuck living in those troubled neighborhoods. So that's the first reality that ignores. The second reality is that, for a growing list of American cities, it's just, not the case that things are better off than they were in the 90s. I mean, if you just go through major American cities, big cities, small cities, medium-sized cities, more than 24 have either broken or surpassed their 1990s crime peaks in terms of homicide numbers just in the last 2 years. You've got another half dozen at least that are, sort of flirting with those numbers now and may very well set new records before January 1st. So, this is a real problem. It's not one I think, the left and the sort of radical elements of the criminal justice reform movement can minimize much longer without Americans calling their bluff.
Well, what about then there's our mayor, who it's everyone's fault but the criminals. It's the store owners who don't have armed security guards in front of their place. It's Facebook. Our mayor said yesterday that Facebook has to do more to stop these people from selling the stolen items on Facebook.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it doesn't seem to have occurred to her quite yet that there's actually quite a bit of power in her office to do something about this, maybe a little more than Mark Zuckerberg can do from Palo Alto. I think this just speaks to the mayor's frustration and the reality that I think she realizes that the broader infrastructure just isn't there, even if, she was deeply committed to doing something about violent crime, right? At the end of the day, having a mayor on the side of pro-social norms and crime minimization is good, but she's going to need a prosecutor on her side. She doesn't have that in Kim Foxx. And she's going to need, a police department that has been enabled. And unfortunately, the city council, the state legislature seem to be doing everything that they can to frustrate the efforts of police. I mean, if you just look at some of these really horrific crimes and just look at, the criminal histories of the people that have been arrested for those crimes and charged with those crimes, I mean, time and again, you'll see, a dozen, 24 prior arrests, multiple prior convictions, prior prison stints, active criminal justice statuses, right? I mean, how many times have you seen people killed in the city of Chicago this year by someone who was either awaiting the disposition of their case out on bail or pretrial release, or was on probation or was on parole? What that tells you is that the police are doing a pretty good job of identifying who the problems are. And they're arresting them. And we know that because every time we see a homicide suspect, criminal history sort of described in a news piece, they've got 15, 16, 20 prior arrests. So, it seems to me that the broader infrastructure just needs to be more robust and more actors need to be held accountable. And I think that means Kim Foxx. I think that means, the people downstate in Springfield that have been enabling a lot of this through policy.
I want to get your response to another piece of the spin coming from the left. This was nicely illustrated in this exchange you're about to hear. Peter Doocy from Fox News querying White House spokesperson Jen Psaki about prosecutors.
Do you think it's possible that big cities are dealing with these smash and grab robberies right now, an increase in criminal activity because some prosecutors are too soft on crime?
I would say we have seen, I'm not going to attribute the reasoning from here. What I will tell you is we have seen an increase in crime over the course of the pandemic.
And I'll just leave it there. This is the pandemic has caused the spike in crime.
Yeah, this is, a really popular talking point. Unfortunately, though, all the relevant data points are in tension with it, right? I mean, the pandemic was global in its impact. The homicide spike was not a global phenomenon, right? I mean, look at big cities around the world, Paris, Berlin, London, Toronto, Mexico City. I mean, none of these places saw homicide spikes anywhere near the size of the spikes seen across the United States. And even within the United States, crime in 2020 remained as concentrated geographically as it ever was, right? Even though the pandemic affected everybody. So if pandemics caused violence, we would have seen a lot more violence in places that didn't traditionally see violence in the past. Unfortunately, what we saw was that the crime spike was pretty much relegated to the places that were already struggling with elevated levels of violent crime. So that's point number one. Point number two is that there's no real clear mechanism through which the pandemic seems to have affected crime. Some people say that it's the financial impact, the economic impact, right? But if you go back historically, again, there's just not a strong correlation between socioeconomic indicators and violence, right? I mean, during the Great Recession, for example, between 2007 and 2010, the unemployment rate across the United States nearly doubled. At the same time, however, the homicide rate declined by about 15%. In Illinois, we've seen black male unemployment decline between 2014 and 2016 by about 20%. During that same period, you had a huge homicide spike. It's just not at all clear what they mean by this. I think what they're counting on is that the American people will just buy the plausibility of, hey, well, there was a shock to the system, therefore, it must have affected crime too. but that's just not true.
He is Rafael Mangual, Senior Fellow and Head of Research for the Manhattan Institute's Policing and Public Safety Initiative, also the author of forthcoming book, Criminal Injustice, What the Push for Mass Decarceration and Deploying Gets Wrong and Who It Hurts the Most. That's coming out in July of next year. Rafael, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, Dan and Amy.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's what Chicago is talking about. It's Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy on AM 560. The Answer.
This is Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com for Town Hall. President Biden and his team like to talk about how popular their agenda is with voters. The White House talks about electric vehicles at